dearest confidants. What is sainthood, if not a mask for blood and smoke? Tonight, forget your gilded chapels and your perfumed prayers, for our tale unfolds in a soot-stained hovel where herbs burn sharper than incense, and a widow's trembling hands pierce outlaw flesh with sinew, not silk. Picture it, Lady Alianor, a noble woman of stone halls and velvet veils, kneeling in the firelight, stitching torn muscle like a penitent nun sewing wounds into her own soul. And the thorn? He grits his teeth and bleeds, his low growl echoing the very beast he felled for her life.
Smoke, thick and pungent with unfamiliar herbs, something sharp and resinous like crushed pine needles overlaying the ever-present acrid tang of charcoal, stung Alianor's eyes and clawed at her throat, making each breath a rasping effort. Eamon Thorne sat hunched on a low stool beside the hearth in his cramped, soot-blackened cottage, his back a rigid, unyielding wall turned towards her. Firelight danced over the rough stone walls, revealing bundles of drying herbs hanging like spectral hands from the low rafters, shelves cluttered with clay pots, holding unguents and strange twisted roots, and the stark evidence of violence. His rough spun tunic was torn at the shoulder, stained a dark, ominous crimson that looked black as pitch in the flickering gloom. His right arm rested awkwardly across his lap, the powerful muscle of his bicep, a swollen, angry mess of torn flesh, and deep, ragged punctures where the wolf's fangs had found purchase, before his staff had shattered its skull. The memory, the ember green eyes, the lightning lunge, the sickening crack of wood on bone, the pained, dying yelp, replayed relentlessly behind Alianor's own eyes, a visceral loop of terror and awe. He'd saved her life, risked his own, for the Lady of Stone. The weight of that debt pressed on her chest, heavier than the smoke-laden air. A sharp hiss escaped Eamon's clenched teeth as Alianor pressed a steaming, herb-soaked cloth to the deepest wound. The clean, slightly bitter scent of yarrow and shepherd's purse rose with the steam, a small defiance against the stench of blood and fear. "Hold still," Alianor murmured, her voice tight with a fear that had nothing to do with the man before her, and everything to do with the brutal reality etched into his skin, the violence that had brushed so close to extinguishing her own fragile light. Her hands trembled slightly despite her iron resolve, the heat of the cloth seeping into her chilled fingers. "'Tis not," Eamon ground out, though the rigid set of his shoulders, the corded muscles standing out in his neck, and the white-knuckled grip of his left hand on his knee betrayed the lie. Sweat beaded on his temple, despite the cottage's chill, tracing clean lines through the grime and ash coating his skin. His jaw was clenched so tight, Alianor could see the pulse hammering beneath the stubble. "Clean it, bind it, be done." His voice was rough gravel, stripped of its earlier intensity by raw, grinding pain. Alianor dipped the cloth back into the small iron pot, simmering on the hearthstones, the water swirling with bruised leaves and petals. She pressed it firmly against the worst bite again. His whole body tensed, a low, involuntary growl vibrating deep in his chest, startlingly akin to the predator he'd fought and felled. But he didn't pull away, enduring the cleansing agony with a stillness that spoke of immense willpower. "It needs stitching," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, as she examined the ragged edges of flesh glistening in the firelight. Her hands, usually deft with needle and silk, felt clumsy, alien to this brutal task of mending muscle and sinew. "I have needle and thread." She fumbled in the small pouch at her belt, pulling out her delicate sewing kit. Fine bone needles and coils of shimmering silk thread, absurdly fragile in this setting of blood and survival. Eamon's head snapped around. His gray eyes, clouded with pain, but still fiercely alert, locked onto the delicate implements. A flicker of something, stark disbelief shading into grim, almost contemptuous amusement, crossed his strained face. "Silk?" The word was a rasp, thick with incredulity. "For mending this?" He jerked his chin towards the savaged arm, the movement pulling at the wound and drawing another sharp breath through his teeth. "Use sinew." There. Drying on the ledge, he nodded towards a strip of pale, fibrous material, tough as old leather, near the small, smoke-grimed window. Beside it lay a thick iron needle, more akin to an awl than a sewing tool, its point honed sharp. Alianor stared at the sinew, unyielding and utilitarian, then at the crude needle, a tool for survival, not artistry. This was a world away from her embroidery frame, from the ordered patterns of noble life. This was a world of blood and bone and brutal necessity, where repairs were functional, stark, devoid of grace. Swallowing her revulsion, her ingrained sense of what was fitting for her station, she picked up the iron needle. It felt cold and heavy, alien in her grasp. Threading it with the tough sinew was a struggle. The material resisted, requiring her to wet the end with spit and force it through the crude eye. Her fingers felt thick, unfamiliar with the task, betraying her sheltered existence. "Do it," Eamon commanded, turning his head away again, presenting the wound like a challenge. He picked up a whetstone and the wicked-looking skinning knife lying on the hearthstones and resumed sharpening the blade with fierce, rhythmic strokes. The harsh, grating scrape, scrape, scrape filled the small space, a jarring, almost aggressive counterpoint to the intimate, bloody task before her, a physical manifestation of his effort to master the pain. Taking a deep, steadying breath that tasted of smoke and blood, steeling herself against the intimacy of the act and the raw violence of the wound laid bare, Alianor pushed the thick needle through his torn flesh near the edge of the deepest puncture. He didn't flinch outwardly, but the muscles in his back, beneath the torn tunic, corded impossibly tight, trembling with the strain of control. The whetstone scraped louder, faster, a furious rasp echoing his silent battle. Each pull of the tough sinew, each tug to draw the savage tear closed, felt like a violation of his flesh, and yet forged a connection deeper than words, born in fire, fang, and shared survival. Dark blood welled anew around the stitching, slick and warm against her cold fingers, stark against his weathered skin. She worked quickly, silently, her focus narrowing to the needle, the resistant sinew, the mangled flesh, the relentless scrape, scrape, scrape of the whetstone. The cottage, the choking smoke, the unseen dangers lurking beyond its flimsy walls, all dissolved into this primal act of repair. This strange, silent communion in the firelit dark, bound by blood and necessity. The sinew pulled taut through resistant flesh, each stitch a small victory against the wound's chaos. Eamon's breathing remained shallow, controlled, a stark contrast to the violent song of the whetstone. His stillness was a testament to his endurance, a mountain weathering a storm. When the last stitch was pulled tight and knotted off, the ragged edges held together by a crude line of sinew, Alianor sat back on her heels, exhaling a shuddering breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were sticky with blood and herb-infused water, trembling violently now the intense focus had lifted. She felt utterly drained, hollowed out by the intimacy and the violence, her fine gown spattered with gore, a mark of the world she'd stepped into. Eamon lowered the knife and whetstone, the sudden silence in the cottage profound. He flexed the fingers of his right hand, experimentally, wincing sharply as the stitches pulled. They held, a crude but effective barrier against further damage. Without a word, he reached for a jar of thick, dark salve beside the hearth, the contents smelling sharply of comfrey and something resinous, perhaps pine pitch. Scooping a generous amount with his left hand, he smeared it roughly over the stitched wounds, and the other, shallower bites, littering his forearm before Alianor could react or offer assistance. The sharp, pungent medicinal smell momentarily overpowered the sense of blood and smoke. He then tore a long strip of cleanish, undyed linen from a bolt of rough cloth resting nearby and began binding the arm himself, his movements efficient, practiced, despite the injury and the awkwardness of using his offhand. He wrapped the linen tightly, securing the bandage with a sharp jerk of his teeth and left hand, pulling the knot punishingly tight. He finally turned to look at her fully, the firelight catching the planes of his face, softening the harsh lines etched by pain, but deepening the shadows in his eyes. His gray gaze held hers, searching. "You sew straighter than I expected, lady," he said, his voice still tight, but lacking the earlier hostility, carrying a grudging note of something almost like respect. It was an acknowledgement, stark and unexpected. The unexpected, backhanded compliment, delivered without preamble, startled a shaky breath from Alianor. A fragile bridge, built on shared violence and shared blood, spanning the chasm between their worlds. "And you carve faces better than any minstrel sings tales?" she retorted, the words escaping before caution could silence them, meeting his gaze with a spark of the defiance he'd named fire. It was a truth as undeniable as the stitches in his arm. A log shifted in the hearth, collapsing in a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated the soot-stained rafters like falling stars. Outside, the mournful call of an owl drifted through the night, a lonely counterpoint to the crackling fire. Eamon studied her face, pale beneath smudges of soot and drying blood, her dark hair escaping its braid in wild, damp tendrils clinging to her neck, her eyes wide with lingering fear and exhaustion, yet holding a stubborn core of resolve that had guided her needle through his flesh. He saw the woman who'd faced down a wolf's charge, who hadn't fled screaming, who'd knelt in the blood and stitched him, not just the noble widow trapped in stone walls. "The fire I saw," he murmured, almost to himself, his gaze intense, stripping away the grime and the fear. "It burns brighter in the dark." He pushed himself stiffly to his feet, a fresh wave of pain tightening his features, etching lines around his mouth. He tested his weight on his injured arm, a grimace flickering across his face. "Dawn's not far. You need to be gone before light finds you here." His voice held no warmth now, only urgent practicality, the brief connection severed by the harsh reality of their situations. The spell shattered. The cold reality of her position crashed back with the force of a physical blow. Sister Marjorie's pious spies, noting her absence. Roland's watchful eyes, doubtless already suspicious, missing nothing. The sheer, lethal danger of being discovered in an outlaw's hut. Her cloak and hands stained with his blood. Evidence that could be twisted into any narrative Roland chose. She scrambled to her feet, wiping her hands frantically on a relatively clean corner of her cloak, though the scent of blood, smoke, and pungent comfrey seemed ingrained in her skin, a brand of this night. The Ella campaign, she remembered suddenly, the original, desperate purpose of her perilous journey swallowed whole by the wolf and the blood, the reason she'd risked coming back. For Bess. She needs more. The root is nearly gone. Her voice was tight with renewed anxiety. Eamon merely nodded towards a bundle already tied with coarse twine near the low doorway. "There. Enough for a fortnight. Boil the root strong. Use the steam for the cough if it lingers." He picked up his heavy blood-stained staff, leaning on it heavily, transforming it into a crutch. "Go." Now he fixed her with a look, his gray eyes intense, piercing through the gloom. "And lady, de Mowbray will move. The herbs, the wolf. He'll twist it, shape it to his purpose, like he shapes everything. Be ready." The grim certainty in his voice, the knowledge of Roland's methods, etched into his own ruined life like the scars on his arm, chilled her more profoundly than the frozen journey back to Hawksmere ever could. It wasn't a warning, it was a prophecy. She grabbed the bundle of herbs, the rough twine scraping against her palm. "Thank you, Eamon Thorne," she said, the name feeling deliberate and significant on her tongue, an acknowledgement of the man beyond the outlaw label, the man who saw fire in ash. "For Bess, for my life." The words felt inadequate against the debt, against the rawness of the shared experience. He didn't respond with words, just jerked his head sharply towards the door, his face once again a mask of stoic endurance, carved in firelight and shadow, the pain a visible current beneath the stony surface. Alianor slipped out into the pre-dawn gray, the bundle clutched tightly to her chest like a talisman against the coming storm. The complex scent of blood, wood smoke, healing herbs, and the raw, vital presence of the man inside clung to her, a sensory memory of the night. Along with it, seared into her mind, were his eyes in the firelight and his stark warning ringing like a tocsin in her ears, a sound that drowned out even the fading call of the owl. Be ready. 3 days later, under a brittle, cold sun that offered no warmth, the axe fell. The relative peace Alianor had clawed out, Bess gaining visible strength each day, able to sit up and sip broth without coughing herself breathless. A daily, fragile testament to Aemon's skill and her own desperate journey, shattered like thin ice. She was breaking her fast with Bess in the cramped chamber, the simple broth tasting like ash in her mouth, as she replayed Aemon's warning and the feel of the sinew pulling through his flesh, when the heavy, deliberate tread of boots echoed ominously in the passage outside. Not the quick step of a servant, nor Nan's shuffling gait. This tread spoke of authority and purpose. Father Clement appeared in the doorway, his usually gentle, placid face drawn and deeply anxious, deep shadows under his eyes. His hands were clasped tightly before him, as if in constant prayer, the knuckles white. He couldn't meet her eyes, his gaze fixed somewhere near her feet. Lady Alianor, he began, his voice thin and unsteady, fraying at the edges. You are summoned. To the village square. Before the hour is out. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the sudden silence of the room. Sir Roland, he has petitioned Lord Edmund, an inquest concerning the theft at de Mowbray Castle years past, and the recent presence of a known outlaw near Hawksmere. He hesitated, color rising in his cheeks like a stain. Your presence is required to testify. The final word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Bess gasped sharply behind her, the wooden spoon clattering from her trembling hand into the broth bowl, splashing droplets onto the rough tabletop. The spoon's clatter echoed the sudden, icy dread that plunged into Alianor's stomach, freezing her breath. Be ready. Aemon's words weren't just a warning. They were a map to this moment. Roland hadn't waited for Michaelmas. He was using the old theft, the theft he had orchestrated to ruin Aemon, and the fresh, poisonous whispers about her trips to the Hollow, to strike now, while Lord Edmund was lost in his fog, and she was still reeling from the recent violence. A public spectacle designed to force her hand, to destroy Aemon utterly before the community, and to isolate her completely, to demonstrate, in the most brutal way, the consequences of defiance. Testify? Alianor's voice was remarkably calm, a flat, cold surface over the churning terror and fury beneath. She rose slowly, deliberately smoothing the black wool of her widow's gown, her armor against the world. Testify to what, Father? I know nothing of any theft at de Mowbray Castle. That was years ago, long before my time at Hawksmere. She kept her gaze level on the priest, forcing him to look at her. Father Clement flinched as if struck. Sir Roland, he has witnesses, my lady, he stammered, his gaze darting nervously around the room, avoiding hers. He claims new evidence resurfaces, linking the outlaw, Aemon Thorne, irrefutably, to the crime. And, he faltered, twisting his hands together. There are questions, my lady, questions raised about your own movements of late. Sister Marjorie. He trailed off, unable or unwilling to voice the nun's poisonous insinuations, but his meaning was as clear as the fear in his eyes. He was a man caught between his duty and his conscience, and fear was winning. Sister Marjorie. The realization crystallized with cold, hard clarity. The pious spider at the center of her web. Marjorie had seen her near the hollow, perhaps glimpsed her fleeing after the wolf attack, her cloak askew, certainly knew about the herbs that had saved Bess. She'd observed, she'd judged, and she'd traded those carefully noted scraps to Roland, who was now weaving them, along with the old lies, into a noose for Aemon and a cage for her. A cage disguised as protection, offered with Roland's velvet-gloved hand. I see, Alianor said, her voice devoid of inflection, a void where fear and anger warred. Tell Sir Roland I will attend. Her mind raced, cold and sharp, cutting through the panic like Aemon's skinning knife. What leverage did she have? None. Deny knowing Aemon? Lie outright? But Roland had witnesses, easily bought, frightened liars ready to swear to anything he dictated. Defend him? That would instantly brand her his accomplice, his whore, sealing both their fates and handing Hawksmere to Roland on a platter, wrapped in the justification of rescuing her from corruption. Silence seemed her only shield, but how long could she hide behind it under the weight of public accusation, orchestrated by a master manipulator? The insistent, rhythmic clang of the priory bell, summoning the village to prime, sounded not like a call to prayer, but like a death knell, tolling for Aemon, for her freedom, for Hawksmere. As Alianor, with Bess stubbornly insisting on accompanying her, despite her lingering weakness and pallor, approached the village square, the murmur of a gathering crowd grew louder, transforming from a low hum into a restless, buzzing wave of unease and morbid curiosity. The air itself felt charged, thick with anticipation and the cold. The familiar space, usually bustling with market day chatter or children's games, had transformed into an arena of rough justice under the cold, watchful eye of the stone preaching cross. A makeshift dais, constructed of rough planks that looked hastily assembled, stood near the ancient monument. Lord Edmund sat slumped in the high-backed chair, brought from Hawksmere's hall, swaddled in furs despite the chill, his eyes vacant pools, a thread of drool glistening at the corner of his slack mouth. Beside him, radiating smug, uncontested authority, like a dark sun, stood Sir Roland de Mowbray. He was resplendent in deep blue velvet, trimmed with rich sable, a picture of noble power and control, one hand resting possessively on the back of Lord Edmund's chair, as if already claiming the seat of Hawksmere itself. His dark eyes scanned the gathering crowd with evident satisfaction, a predator surveying the field before the strike, a faint, confident smile playing on his lips. Below the dais, flanked by two of Roland's burly, hard-faced men-at-arms, with hands resting meaningfully on sword pommels, stood Aemon Thorne. His right arm was bound tightly against his chest beneath his tunic, hidden from casual view, but his face was a mask of cold, unwavering defiance. He stood tall despite the guard's proximity, ignoring the hostile murmurs, rippling through the crowd like a contagion, his gray eyes fixed not on his accuser, but on the space where Alianor would emerge from the press. A fresh, livid bruise darkened his jawline, clearly not from the wolf, a silent testament to Roland's methods of ensuring cooperation. Sister Marjorie sat primly on a stool, placed near the dais steps, a position of prominence, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her sharp eyes missing nothing, a faint, unsettlingly pious smile playing on her thin lips as she surveyed the scene she had helped orchestrate. She looked like a cat who had cornered a mouse. The crowd murmured, a restless sea of faces, some angry, fists clenched, some fearful, eyes wide, many simply curious, eager for the spectacle Roland promised. Whispers hissed like venomous snakes through the chill air. Thief, outlaw filth, witches get, they say, deals with dark things. Where's the widow? They say she consorts with him. Roland's poison, carefully disseminated, had taken root, tainting the very air. A path cleared reluctantly as Alianor approached the dais, Bess hovering protectively, though pale and unsteady, at her elbow, her breathing still slightly labored. The stares of the villagers were a physical weight pressing in on her. Pity in some older women's eyes, suspicion in many more, outright hostility in the faces of men Roland had doubtless paid or promised favors. The whispers intensified as she passed. Seen her slipping out near dawn. Cloak pulled high over fine clothes. Smelled charcoal smoke on her gown, plain as day, after Godfrey passed. Thinks she's above the law, like all nobles, consorting with scum. Roland's narrative, fed by Marjorie's pious observations, had taken deep root, isolating her before she could even speak. She stopped before the dais, forcing her spine straight, her chin level, meeting the storm head-on. She met Roland's gaze, His smile widened, slow and predatory, the triumph gleaming in his dark eyes, barely concealed. "Lady Alianor!" His voice boomed, smooth and commanding, effortlessly cutting through the crowd's murmur like a knife. "How gracious of you to join us in this solemn hour. We seek only truth and justice today. Justice for the theft of my silver, a crime that has long festered like a wound in the heart of the peak. Justice for the lawlessness that creeps into our peaceful lands, embodied by the blight standing before you." He gestured with theatrical disdain towards Aemon, his voice dripping with contempt. "Behold the accused, Aemon Thorne, branded thief by lawful inquest, outlaw by his own cowardly flight, a poison in the heart of our community." He spat the words, painting Aemon as a disease. Aemon didn't react, didn't even deign to glance at Roland. His gaze remained fixed on Alianor. In those fierce gray depths, she saw no plea, no expectation of rescue, only a grim, unwavering acceptance of the fate he knew Roland had designed, and a silent, searing question. "What will you do, Lady of Stone? Where does your fire burn now? Will it gutter or will it blaze?" Roland called his witnesses. First, a shifty-eyed, weasel-faced man Alianor recognized as a disreputable stable hand from de Mowbray, known more for pilfering oats than honesty. He swore on a rusted pilgrim's badge, clutched in trembling fingers, that he'd seen a dark, thieving figure, tall and broad-shouldered like Thorne, lurking near the treasury window, on the very night the silver vanished, my lord. His eyes darted nervously to Roland, seeking approval. Next, a weaver's wife, her face pale and tear-streaked, her hands twisting her apron under Roland's imposing gaze. She stammered that she'd seen Aemon skulking near Hawksmere's boundary wall, around the time poor Sir Godfrey was took, milady. Her words heavy, with unspoken implication about convenient deaths and dark dealings. Lies, woven with just enough circumstantial detail, delivered with convincing fear under Roland's watchful eye and the implicit threat of his power. The crowd's murmur grew angrier, a low growl of its own rising. A rotten cabbage flew from the back ranks, arcing through the air and splattering messily near Aemon's feet, spraying foul-smelling muck. One of Roland's guards stepped forward instantly, his face a mask of brutality, shoving the thrower roughly back into the crowd with a snarl. "Order! Keep order!" Roland commanded, though his eyes held satisfaction at the rising anger he'd stoked. Then Roland turned, his expression shifting to one of grave concern, the benevolent lord seeking spiritual guidance. "Good Sister Marjorie, you serve God and this community with a watchful eye and a pure heart, a beacon in troubled times. Have you observations gleaned in your holy duties, tending the sick and sorrowful, pertinent to this man's character and his recent troubling activities near our homes?" He gave her the stage, the perfect vessel for his poison. Marjorie rose with practiced serenity, smoothing the non-existent wrinkles from her habit, radiating sanctimonious concern. She was in her element. "Indeed, Sir Roland," she began, her voice carrying clearly, a model of pious gravity. "In my humble service, ministering to souls burdened by sin and sickness, one cannot help but hear whispers carried on the wind of unease that blows through our valley. Whispers of a dangerous presence dwelling in the forbidden depths of Thorn's Hollow, a place shunned by God-fearing folk. Whispers of potent herbs gathered from shadowed places where the sun fears to touch, appearing where they should not, bringing unnatural recovery where nature and prayer had failed." Her gaze, cold and sharp as flint, slid meaningfully, deliberately towards Alianor, pinning her in place. "And it grieves my spirit deeply, wounds my Christian conscience to speak of it, but whispers also circulate concerning the Lady Alianor. Unexplained absences from her duties at Hawksmere during times of grief and household trial. Journeys undertaken alone, cloaked in secrecy, towards perilous and prescribed places under the cover of darkness, when decent folk are abed." She clasped her hands, lifting her eyes briefly skyward in a show of pained piety. "I pray only for divine guidance and protection for us all in these troubled, uncertain times, That truth, however painful, may shine forth and cleanse our community of any corruption. She sat down, her duty done, her poisonous seed sown with perfect, holy precision. The implication landed like a stone in a still pond, sending visible ripples of shock and heightened suspicion through the crowd. Alianor felt the collective gaze shift and sharpen upon her, heavy with accusation, speculation, and dawning condemnation. Witch, traitor, outlaw's whore. Roland's trap was sprung with devastating precision. He'd publicly, irrevocably linked her to Aemon and the Forbidden Hollow, tarnished her reputation beyond easy repair, and isolated her from any potential support within the community. His victory seemed not just assured, but already celebrated in the smug set of his shoulders. Roland held up a hand, commanding silence with effortless authority, his expression now one of profound, regretful concern, the velvet glove finally removed to reveal the iron fist beneath. Such deeply troubling associations cast a long shadow over us all, threatening the peace and sanctity of Hawksmere Dale. Lady Alianor, he turned to her, his voice dripping with false sympathy, each word a carefully placed barb. For the sake of clarity, for the safety of Hawksmere and its loyal people, and for the sanctity of justice itself, we must ask you directly, before God and this assembly gathered in this solemn hour. He paused, letting the silence stretch, thick with dreadful anticipation, the crowd leaning forward as one. What is the nature of your acquaintance with this man? He gestured dismissively at Aemon, a condemned man already in the eyes of the mob he'd stirred. Do you know Aemon Thorne? The square fell utterly, deathly silent. Even the wind seemed to still, holding its breath. Every eye, wide with anticipation or narrowed with suspicion, was fixed solely on Alianor. Lord Edmund mumbled incoherently, lost in his private fog, a puppet in his own hall. Sister Marjorie watched, her pious mask firmly in place, but a faint, satisfied curve to her lips betrayed her triumph. Roland's smile was a thin, triumphant blade, sharp enough to draw blood. His guard shifted, hands tightening on their weapons, ready for any outcome. Aemon stood rigid, a statue carved from defiance and grim acceptance, his face unreadable stone. But his eyes, those fierce, burning gray eyes, locked onto hers, boring into her soul, demanding, challenging. Fire is rare and worth marking. Show me. Alianor's heart hammered against her ribs like a frantic bird trapped in a snare, its wings beating a desperate rhythm against her bones. Her mouth was parchment dry, her tongue leaden. The weight of expectation, of public accusation, of Roland's crushing power, and Marjorie's sanctified venom pressed down on her, a physical force threatening to buckle her knees. The cold air burned her lungs. To deny him now, to deny knowing Aemon, felt futile, cowardly, against the tide of lies and insinuation Marjorie had unleashed. To defend him, to speak the truth of his saving her life, of the herbs, of the wolf, would be social and political suicide, instantly branding her, his accomplice, his lover, sealing both their fates and handing Hawksmere irrevocably to Roland. She would be ruined, imprisoned, or worse. Bess's frightened whimper behind her, a soft sound of pure terror, was a dagger twist of guilt and love, a reminder of the cost of defiance. She looked at Aemon, truly looked beyond the defiance, at the man who'd seen her soul and carved it in wood with startling clarity, at the man who'd faced a starving wolf for her without hesitation, who bore the wounds of that fight silently, at the man broken by the same monster who now sought to break her, to grind her spirit into dust beneath his velvet heel. She saw the fire he claimed burned within her, banked by layers of duty, fear, and societal chains, but not extinguished. Roland offered a gilded tomb, a life of silent suffocation within velvet-lined walls, her spirit extinguished. Aemon offered nothing tangible, only danger, truth, exile, and a terrifying spark of raw, undeniable life, a path lit by an honest, if perilous, flame. She took a step forward, away from Bess's trembling presence, towards the dais, towards Roland's expectant, gloating face, towards the silent, watching crowd holding its collective breath. She drew herself up to her full height, the widow of Hawksmere, shedding the shroud of passive grief and quiet fear like an old skin. The black wool gown felt less like armor now, more like a banner of who she had been and who she refused to be any longer. She opened her mouth, the silence screaming in her ears. The expected words, the denial, the condemnation of Aemon that would secure her temporary hollow safety within Roland's cage, hovered on her tongue, bitter as gall, the taste of surrender. A single, sharp collective intake of breath came from the crowd, a gasp that sucked the remaining air from the square. The creak of Roland's boot shifting impatiently on the wooden dais was loud as a gunshot in the stillness. High above, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below, the mournful, circling cry of a buzzard riding the cold air currents seemed to underscore the moment's terrible weight, the inevitability of death in scavenging. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring drawn to its breaking point, waiting for her arrow to fly. The fire within her, banked for so long, flared white-hot.
Well, well, what vows were whispered here, though none were spoken? Our Lady's hands, sticky with blood, bind her closer to a thorn than any priest's blessing could dare sanction. He named her fire, and tonight, beneath rafters dripping with smoke, it burned brighter in the dark. But hush, do you hear it? The tolling bell, not a call to prayer, but a summons to judgment. Hawksmere's square awaits, a stage dressed for ruin, where velvet-clad wolves and sanctimonious sisters sharpen their tongues sharper than any blade. And there, before God and gossip alike, Lady Alianor must stand. So I ask you, dearest confidants, when the saint's hour ends and the crowd demands a sacrifice, will she deny the thorn or ignite the scandal of a lifetime? Ah, the bell tolls, and only fire shall answer.